An aging widow donated her savings to a charity, not realizing it would lead her to true love again. Margaret Ellis stood at her living room window, watching autumn leaves dance across her empty driveway. 47 years in this house, and now it felt hollow, each room an echo chamber of memories. 18 months since Robert's passing, yet sometimes she still set 2 places at the dinner table out of habit. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, startling her from her reverie. The sound used to comfort her. Now it merely punctuated the silence. Margaret turned away from the window, her eyes falling on Robert's reading chair. A fine layer of dust had settled on the armrests. She hadn't had the heart to clean it. Beside it sat a stack of charity pamphlets the hospice nurse had left her months ago. She'd been meaning to look through them but couldn't bring herself to do it. The hospice had been so kind during Robert's final weeks. Perhaps it was time. She picked up the pamphlets with trembling fingers and settled into her own chair. The first few were for large national organizations. The last one, dog-eared and slightly wrinkled, was for a local charity called New Beginnings. It helped families affected by terminal illness rebuild their lives. Something about its modest appearance touched her. "This one," she whispered to the empty room. The following morning, Margaret dressed with unusual care, a pale blue blouse Robert had always loved, a touch of lipstick. She felt almost foolish for the effort, but it had been so long since she'd had a reason to leave the house beyond grocery shopping and doctor appointments. The New Beginnings office was smaller than she expected, nestled between a bakery and a bookstore on Main Street. A bell tinkled softly as she pushed open the door. The reception area was warm and inviting. Walls painted a soft yellow, comfortable chairs, and vases of fresh daisies. "Hello there," called a friendly voice. A young woman with bright eyes approached. "I'm Sophia. How can I help you today?" Margaret clutched her handbag a little tighter. "I'd like to make a donation." "That's wonderful! Would you like to speak with our director? He's just finishing up a call." Before Margaret could answer, a door opened and a man in his early 60s emerged. His silver hair contrasted with surprisingly youthful eyes, deep blue and crinkled at the corners from smiling. "I'm David Thornton," he said, extending his hand. His palm was warm and calloused. Working hands, Robert would have called them. "Would you like to come into my office?" Margaret nodded, following him into a modest room lined with photographs of families and thank you cards. She sat across from him, noticing the coffee mug on his desk that read, "World's Okayest Boss," and the subtle shake in his left hand as he set down a file. "So, you're interested in supporting our work?" David asked. "Yes." Margaret took a deep breath. "My husband Robert passed away last year. Cancer. The hospice was wonderful, but afterward, there's not much help for the ones left behind." David nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not with pity, but with understanding. I have some savings," she continued. "We were always careful with money. Robert believed in being prepared." Her voice caught slightly. "But being prepared for living without him? That wasn't something we discussed." "No one ever really can," David said softly. Margaret opened her checkbook. "I'd like to donate $50,000. David's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's extremely generous, Mrs. Ellis." Margaret Ellis. "And it's not generosity, not really." She looked down at her hands. "It's just sitting in an account. What good is it doing there? At least this way, it might help someone who's where I was a year ago." David studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Ellis, would you mind if I asked you something?" She nodded. "Have you considered becoming involved with our organization beyond your donation? We have a program where former caregivers and those who've lost loved ones mentor families currently going through similar situations." Margaret felt a flutter of panic. "Oh, I don't think I'd be very good at that. I haven't been very social lately. Neither was I after my wife died." The words were simple, matter of fact. "It took me 3 years to even look at another person without seeing her absence first." Margaret's eyes met his. In that moment, something passed between them, a current of shared experience no words could adequately express. "Think about it," he said, writing down a number on a card. "We have a volunteer orientation next Tuesday. No pressure." She took the card, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I'll think about it." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The conversation with David had stirred something inside her, not just memories of Robert, but something else, a restlessness. A tiny voice whispering that perhaps her story wasn't over yet. She got up and made tea, cradling the warm mug between her palms. Robert would want her to move forward. He'd told her as much in those final days, though she'd refused to listen then. Tuesday came, and Margaret found herself standing outside the New Beginnings office again, 15 minutes early for the orientation. Her heart hammered in her chest. She nearly turned around twice. "You came," David said, appearing at the door with that same warm smile. "I'm glad." The orientation included 5 other volunteers, 2 middle-aged women who had lost children, an elderly man who had been a caregiver for his brother, and a young couple who had survived their daughter's battle with leukemia. Margaret said little, overwhelmed by their stories and the raw emotion in the room. Afterward, as the others filed out, David approached her. "How are you feeling?" "Inadequate," she admitted. "These people have been through so much, and they're so resilient. I can barely get through my days sometimes." "That's exactly why you'd be perfect," David said. "You're still in it. You understand the struggle in a way those further along might have forgotten." He invited her for coffee at the bakery next door. She surprised herself by accepting. They sat by the window, steam rising from their cups, talking about everything and nothing, books they'd read, places they'd visited, the way grief ambushed you in the cereal aisle or during car commercials. "I sometimes set the table for 2, Margaret confessed. "I kept buying Joanne's favorite ice cream for months," David replied. "Couldn't stop myself." When they parted, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. She agreed to attend the volunteer training the following week. The training was intensive. 3 evenings of learning about grief counseling, active listening, and the practical support New Beginnings offered. Margaret absorbed it all, finding herself increasingly drawn to the work. By the end, she had been assigned to mentor a woman named Claire, whose husband was in the final stages of pancreatic cancer. Her first meeting with Claire was terrifying. What wisdom could she possibly offer? But as they sat in Claire's kitchen, watching the rain against the windows, Margaret found herself simply listening, occasionally sharing small pieces of her own journey. When Claire broke down describing her fear of sleeping alone, Margaret took her hand and held it, offering no platitudes, just presence. "Thank you," Claire whispered as Margaret left. "No one else understands?" That night, Margaret called David on impulse. "I don't know if I'm helping her or making things worse," she confessed. "You showed up," David said. "That's more than most people do." Their conversations became a regular occurrence, after volunteer meetings, during lunch breaks, occasionally in the evening when the silence in Margaret's house became too much. They talked about their work, their pasts, their spouses. David had been a contractor before his wife's illness changed everything. Margaret had taught elementary school until retiring to care for Robert. Weeks passed, and Margaret found herself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else. She began taking more care with her appearance, even bought a new dress, her first since Robert's funeral. She caught herself smiling at random moments. One evening in late November, David invited her to help with the charity's Thanksgiving dinner for client families. They worked side by side in the community center kitchen, preparing turkey and stuffing for 30 people. When their hands accidentally touched while reaching for the same serving spoon, neither pulled away immediately. "I'm glad you came into our office that day," David said quietly. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "So am I." The dinner was chaotic and beautiful, families finding moments of joy amid their struggles. Margaret moved among them, refilling glasses, listening to stories, holding a crying teenager whose mother was too ill to attend. Throughout the evening, she would catch David's eye across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. As they cleaned up afterward, alone in the quiet kitchen, David asked, "Would you like to have dinner sometime? Just the 2 of us?" Margaret froze, a stack of plates in her hands. "Like a date?" "Yes," he said simply. "Like a date." Panic fluttered in her chest. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." David nodded, no disappointment visible on his face. "The invitation stands whenever you are." That night, Margaret sat in Robert's reading chair for the first time since his death. "What would you think about this?" she asked the empty room. She could almost hear his practical voice. "Maggie, life's for the living." Still, she didn't call David for 3 days. When she finally did, her voice trembled slightly. "Is that dinner invitation still open?" They met at a small Italian restaurant the following Friday. Margaret spent an hour choosing her outfit, a deep burgundy dress she'd bought years ago and never worn. As she fastened her pearl earrings, she caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. There was color in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes that had been absent for so long. Dinner was both comfortable and thrilling. They already knew so much about each other, yet there was the unmistakable electricity of a first date, the careful consideration of words, the lingering glances, the tentative touches as he helped her with her coat. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" David asked as they left the restaurant. "There's a park nearby with a nice path." The December air was crisp, but not unpleasant. Christmas lights twinkled in storefronts they passed. Their hands brushed once, twice, until David gently took hers. Margaret's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. "I feel guilty sometimes," she admitted as they walked. "Like I'm betraying Robert." David squeezed her hand gently. "I understand. I felt the same way the first time I laughed after Joanne died. Like I was forgetting her." "Does it get easier?" "Not easier," he said thoughtfully. "Different. You start to understand that moving forward doesn't mean leaving them behind. They become part of your foundation, rather than your whole building." They stopped beside a fountain, its water frozen in midair, crystallized by the cold. In the moonlight, it looked magical, suspended between movement and stillness. "That's how I've felt," Margaret whispered. "Frozen. Until recently." David turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the Christmas lights. "And now? Now I feel like I might be thawing." He smiled, then slowly, giving her every chance to step away, leaned forward and kissed her cheek. His lips were warm against her cold skin. "Too fast?" he asked. Margaret shook her head, surprising herself. "No, not too fast." As winter deepened, so did their relationship. They took things slowly, dinner dates, long walks, afternoons spent volunteering together. David introduced Margaret to his daughter and her family. She showed him Robert's woodworking shop in the garage, untouched since his death. "He was talented," David said, running his fingers over a half-finished jewelry box. "He was making it for our anniversary," Margaret explained. "He never got to finish it." The next week, David asked if he could complete the jewelry box. Margaret hesitated, then agreed. She sat in the garage watching him work, his hands steady and sure as he sanded and fitted the tiny brass hinges. "Robert would have done it differently," he said at one point. "Yes," Margaret acknowledged. "But this is your way." When he finished, the box was beautiful, not exactly as Robert would have made it, but perfect in its own right. David placed it in her hands without a word. Inside, Margaret found a small note. "The past and present can exist together. Both are precious." She cried then, not from grief, but from something more complex, the bittersweet understanding that her heart had expanded rather than replaced one love with another. Their first real kiss came on New Year's Eve, beneath a sky scattered with stars. Margaret had invited David to her home for a quiet celebration. They sat on her back porch, bundled in blankets, sharing memories of holidays past and tentative hopes for the future. As midnight approached, David took her hand. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you." His voice was steady, but she could feel a slight tremor in his fingers. "I wasn't looking for this. Neither were you. But here we are." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." "Terrified, actually." He smiled ruefully. "But I'd rather be scared with you than comfortable without you." The grandfather clock inside began to chime midnight, 12 solemn notes counting down the old year. "Happy New Year, Margaret," David said softly. "Happy New Year, David." Their lips met as the final chime faded. A gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening with a lifetime of experience and the sweet uncertainty of new beginnings. Spring arrived with a burst of renewal. Margaret's garden, neglected the previous year, bloomed under her renewed attention. David often joined her, his contractor's hands surprisingly gentle with delicate seedlings. They worked side by side, comfortable in silence or conversation. "I've been thinking," David said one afternoon as they planted tomatoes. "The charity's fundraising gala is next month." Margaret nodded, patting soil around a plant. "I've been helping with the preparations. Would you consider being my date? Officially?" He looked almost boyishly nervous. "Everyone already knows we're seeing each other. But I'd like to make it, well, public." Margaret sat back on her heels, considering. Being seen together at charity functions was one thing. This felt different, a declaration. "I'd be honored," she finally said. The night of the gala, Margaret stood before her mirror in a midnight blue gown she'd splurged on for the occasion. Her silver hair was styled elegantly, and she wore the pearl necklace Robert had given her on their 30th anniversary. It felt right somehow, carrying a piece of him into this new chapter. David arrived with a corsage of white roses. When he saw her, he stopped in the doorway, speechless for a moment. "You are breathtaking," he finally said. At the gala, they moved among the donors and volunteers, their hands often finding each other. Margaret noticed whispers and smiles but found she didn't mind. When David introduced her to the board members as the woman who stole my heart by donating her savings, she blushed but didn't contradict him. During a quiet moment, as the orchestra played softly, David led her to a secluded balcony overlooking the garden. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice unusually serious. Margaret's heart quickened. "Yes?" "The charity is opening a new facility in Riverside. They've asked me to direct it." He took both her hands in his. "It's a wonderful opportunity, but it would mean moving. I'd be about 40 miles from here." "Oh." Margaret felt a complex swirl of emotions, happy for him, but suddenly aware of what his absence would mean in her life. "I don't want to be apart from you," he continued. "These past months have been the most alive I've felt in years." He took a deep breath. "Would you consider coming with me? Not just to the new location, but into a new life together?" Margaret stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" David smiled nervously. "I'm not proposing marriage. Not yet, anyway. But I am proposing that we stop pretending we're just dating casually. I love you, Margaret Ellis. I want to build something with you." Tears filled her eyes. "What would that even look like? We're both in our 60s. We have separate homes, separate lives. It would look like whatever we want it to look," he said simply. "We could find a place together near the new center, or keep both our homes, travel between them. The details don't matter to me. What matters is that I don't want to start this new chapter without you beside me." Margaret looked out at the garden below, thinking of her home filled with memories of Robert, of the life she'd built and lost, and was somehow building again. "I need time to think," she said finally. David nodded, kissing her hand. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere without you." The following weeks were filled with soul-searching. Margaret visited Robert's grave, placing fresh flowers and sitting beside the headstone. "I never expected this," she told him. "To feel this way again? Is it wrong?" A gentle breeze stirred the cemetery trees, sending a shower of cherry blossoms across the grass. She thought about what David had said about the past and present existing together. She called her son in California, nervously explaining the situation. "Mom, are you asking for my permission?" he asked, sounding surprised. "No, I suppose I'm asking for your blessing." There was a pause. "Do you love him?" "Yes," she said, realizing it was the first time she'd spoken the words aloud. "I do love him." "Then you have my blessing. Dad would want you to be happy. We all do." Margaret visited Claire, her first mentee, now 6 months a widow herself. They sat in Claire's garden, drinking lemonade. "If someone had told me last year that I'd be considering moving in with a man I met because I donated money to his charity, I'd have said they were crazy," Margaret confessed. Claire smiled. "Life has a strange way of surprising us, sometimes cruelly, sometimes beautifully. Are you happy for me?" Margaret asked, suddenly needing to know. Claire reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You showed me that there's life after devastating loss. How could I not be happy that you're proving it again?" One evening in late May, Margaret invited David to dinner at her home. She'd spent the day cooking Robert's favorite pot roast, a choice that felt significant, though she couldn't articulate why. As they ate, she told David stories about her life with Robert, their early struggles, the birth of their son, the small rituals that had defined their marriage. He listened attentively, occasionally sharing his own memories of Joanne. After dinner, Margaret led him to the living room where 2 packed suitcases stood by the door. David looked at them, then at her, a question in his eyes. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "About building something new together. And..." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And I think we should visit Riverside this weekend. Look at some properties. See if we can imagine a life there." She took a deep breath. Together. The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her in his arms, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. "I love you, Margaret Ellis," he whispered against her hair. "I love you too, David Thornton." The words felt both strange and perfectly natural on her lips. That summer, they found a charming craftsman house halfway between their old homes, with a generous garden and a workshop perfect for David's woodworking. Margaret kept her house too, not ready to part with it completely, but willing to make it a weekend retreat rather than her primary residence. The New Beginnings Center opened in September. Margaret took on the role of volunteer coordinator, her natural teaching abilities making her perfect for training new mentors. Together, she and David expanded the program, reaching more families, creating more connections. On the 1-year anniversary of her first donation, David planned a special dinner at the Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date. Margaret wore the burgundy dress again, paired with the completed jewelry box holding her treasured pearls. Over dessert, David reached across the table for her hand. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't walked into our office that day?" Margaret smiled. "I think about it often. How a simple decision changed everything. You know," he said thoughtfully, "when you made that donation, you said you wanted your savings to help someone who was where you had been, to make a difference in their life." "Yes." She nodded. "What you didn't realize was that the person you would help most was yourself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "And me." Margaret's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple silver ring with a single pearl. "Margaret Ellis, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of continuing this unexpected journey together?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked at the ring, then at the man who had brought love back into her life when she least expected it. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Margaret thought about the winding path that had led her here, from devastating loss to an impulsive donation to finding love again. How the money she'd set aside for a future with Robert had somehow built her a bridge to a different future, one she never could have imagined. Later that night, as they walked hand in hand beneath a canopy of stars, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. For Robert and the life they'd shared. For David and the life they were building. For the mysterious ways in which endings sometimes became beginnings. An aging widow had donated her savings to a charity, not realizing it would lead her to true love again. But now, beneath the vast night sky, Margaret Ellis understood that the greatest donation had been not of money, but of her heart. And the greatest return was the joy of discovering that even in the winter of life, spring could still arrive, unexpected and beautiful.